Understanding Indigenous Education and Perspectives. Women Jeka. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I present today, the Wurundjeri people. Here on a gathering point for members of the Kulin Nation, where age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation, and regeneration took place, I pay my respects to the elders both past, present, and future. Our cultural orientation begins at birth. In 1993, Hadley, cited in Levy 2007, placed emphasis on how our cultural background shapes our attitudes, emotions, beliefs, and values, and how there are associated dangers of projecting one's native frame of reference on that of the culture being considered. Our cultural orientation begins at birth. In 1993, Hadley, cited in Levy 2007, placed emphasis on how our cultural background shapes our attitudes, emotions, beliefs, and values, and how there are associated dangers with projecting one's native frame of reference on that of the culture being considered. Before leaving to travel around Australia with my family in an old beat-up caravan for a year, vague memories flood back in relation to the introduction of Australian history in my primary school. It was taught that the history of Australia only began around 1770 after the first fleet of British ships reached the shores of East Coast Australia. The European colonisation created a new dominant society in Australia in place of the pre-existing population of Aboriginal Australians, treating Australia as terra nullius, an empty land or no man's land. My education of Australian history was covered with what Rose in 2012 called a colonial blanket, smothering traditional customs including language, knowledge, law, and other cultural expressions. Along with my peers, I too was nearly blinded by the falsifications of the silent apartheid. Though I was fortunate enough to have been able to walk, talk, and learn about country with elders from all over Australia the year I travelled. Developing truth of historical knowledge along the way, truth about how Indigenous Australians lived in Australia long before British colonisation, being one of the oldest living cultures in the world. For a brief moment, I began to learn the truth, but all too soon I returned back to an education system that once again failed me. An education system that Rose in 2012 argued is responsible for visibly concealing and devaluing all facets of Indigenous knowledge, and the ramifications of this cultural and historical suppression embedded in regenerative curriculum overflowed, placing an immense emotional and spiritual impacts onto not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but non-Indigenous people, all denied access to significant understandings of the land in which they live. Personal thoughts reflect the feelings that I abandoned the truth all those years ago, and a strong feeling of failure hindered a sense of my identity as an Australian and as a human being. It is believed by Madison in 2011, when our sense of selves is connected to our ancestors, and when it is known that our ancestors committed harms and atrocities, it follows that collective guilt may be a prominent factor of our national identity. In the views of Price 2015 and Craven 2011, the Australian education system failed to address significant matters to do with recognising the validity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures and their rightful place in Australian society. It is because of this impact of cultural racism and institutionalisation has been so widespread. Patricus in 1988 states, "For good or for bad, we all have biases. Education, however, can turn a bias into a perspective that opens the eyes and allows understanding, rather than into a blinder that restricts vision and ensures ignorance. Perhaps it is not possible to be fully and absolutely objective, but awareness of the problem can lead us to a kind of practical objectivity." Education is changing, lies are being uncovered, and the truth is being told. As an educator equipped with recent and more reputable understanding of Indigenous perspectives, I will strive to create community links fundamental to the 8 Ways pedagogical framework and the Australian curriculum as key collaborative components of my classroom. Annette Sachs, a proud Indigenous woman from the Eastern Kulin Nation, a founder of Yarn Strong Sister, a storyteller, an artist, and an illustrator who paints using ochre and wattle sap on canvas, passes her knowledge her elders have shared with her to the future generations. Working alongside Annette Sack, Dr. Sue Atkinson, a Yorta Yorta woman, is a leading voice on Indigenous identity and conceptualising Aboriginality in early childhood education and care, both focusing on local Victorian cultures. Together and individually, both women's approaches and contributions to the community reflect and build upon the 8 Ways pedagogical framework, providing professional development such as the possum skin pedagogy for early childhood educators, creates strong community links and explicitly maps and visualizes processes, where storytelling and children's art workshops approach learning through narrative and furthermore apply interpersonal and kinesthetic skills to thinking and learning. Louise Derman Sparks' in 2011 research data informs children begin to observe differences at an early age and begin to classify and evaluate categories. Therefore, schools and communities are mutually responsible for closing the gap between the outcomes of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Atkinson recognises that this can raise uncomfortable and complex positions across the education sector, as teachers are concerned about making ethical decisions when embedding authentic Aboriginal culture into the classroom. This reflects the importance of collaborating with elders in your local community. Incorporating Indigenous perspectives authentically into your daily classroom practice via researching tools used past and present in the living art of possum cloak construction, an age-old Wurundjeri tradition, affords students understanding of the narrative of science and technology, continuity and change, reflecting a two-way perspective of Western and Indigenous ways, and furthermore makes connections to the 8-way pedagogical framework and a multitude of cross-curricular priorities in the Australian curriculum, ideally closing the gap and ensuring students develop long and continuous strong connections with country, place, and their economic, cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic value of place, including the idea of custodial responsibility.